on Monday. Thank you. So I appreciate it. Sometimes the weeks are like that, and for some reason, for me, January is always like that too. It seems like January has 56 days in it for some reason. So thanks for being here tonight. Some things you can expect. So at the beginning, we'll do a lot of talking. Okay, nobody likes to be talked at or talked for. However, we do have a lot of information. We want to make sure we can share. You can also expect to see all this information available online at our website. And we'll have the documents, but we'll also have plain language summaries as well for folks. A little bit about me. Again, my name is Wade Walcott. I serve you as the director for the Parks and Recreation Department. I'm a Durham resident. I'm also a father of two that use all of our programs and parks. And I'm someone that you'll be preaching to the choir tonight if you want to talk about how vital parks and open space and programs are to the health and wellness of their community. And I believe that with a passion, and that's why I got into the line of work that I got into. And that's one of the things I'm always bringing up to our friends and our partners with the state, and they can attest to this. It's always about how can we get these spaces back open for everyone to enjoy? But how can we do this safely? So it's our intent is to make sure that these parks and these playgrounds can get open just as soon as possible, but also in a safe way. And that's part of, also my role, my obligation, working for the city, being a servant leader. One of those principles is stewardship. And that's what this whole thing is about tonight, really, is city employees here in this room, we're stewards of other people's resources, of all your resources, your money, your taxpayer dollars, and the actual physical spaces out here. So we're obligated to manage those spaces. And one of my responsibilities is make sure that you're having as much fun as possible. But we're also responsible for the health and wellness and safety for everyone that uses these spaces, along with the safety and the quality of the environment. So these are all these things that we keep in mind as we go through this process. So tonight, one of the first things we'll do is I put together a timeline from when we all first learned about this in June of 23 to where we are now. Some of this will be repeat information for some of you, and some of it may be new information. There's a lot of it, as I said earlier. And so we'll provide all that information for you. And at the end, we'll be available for any questions. You also hear some technical details, or you're going to have some great questions that I may not be able to answer. And by the way, I definitely will not be able to answer some of those. Again, I'm the Parks and Rec person. But we do have great partners here at the state that can help explain it. All right. So, like I said, we'll get started. You'll also hear we have a little bit of information from a group that came in here to talk a little bit about what they do and some opportunities that they want to provide as well. And of course, plenty of time for questions and answers. So again, what I hope that all of you gather out of this presentation is what's the current status of these 5 parks, how we got here, some of the continuous moving parts, some of the things we don't know to date, long-term and short-term considerations, how everyone in Durham will be a part of this. Whether you're a resident lives next door to a park, or whether your resident doesn't live near any of these parks, but they like to use them. Everyone will have a voice and a say as we move forward. And so the way I put this presentation together is just the timeline format that I mentioned earlier. Sprinkled in here will be different times we've had different communication, public engagements, etc. And again, all this will be available to you online. So if you miss something, you'll have it in your hands. And I think there's some packets in the back as well. So some of you that may or may not know, June of 2023 is one at large. We became aware of at least 3 of the issues going on here, Walltown, Easton, and East Durham, as they were previously sites for waste incinerators. We got that information. We immediately started working with a different contractor, Mid-Atlantic Associates, and we took the recommendations from Duke and went ahead and wanted to learn more about Lyon Park and Northgate Park to build upon the science that Duke provided. And then the rest of this, the summer and in the fall was we started posting information. We developed our public website to make sure communication was out there. We also make a lot of effort on making sure there's plain language summaries. It's important to always be transparent, but it's irresponsible if we provide to understand. September, we started, because of the work that Mid-Atlantic put together and building upon the science from Duke, started working with North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. That's DEQ. So I'll say that a few more times, but Department of Environmental Quality started getting involved with them. And they started looking at our parks probably the fall of 23 and assessing those. And they started shortly after seeing if these parks would qualify for what they have as a pre-regulatory landfill program. And there's roughly, not exact, somewhere near 700 of these pre-regulatory landfills throughout the state of North Carolina. And over the next few months, they looked at these 5 parks and assessed various factors, and they'll be able to explain those factors. But looking at a risk score that would help rank them or compare them to some of the other 700 pre-regulatory landfill programs throughout the state. To do that, they started dividing up each park into 25-acre grids and started looking at the soils there. Then in January of 2024, after I don't know how long, I think decades, for a long time, the EPA had a threshold of 400 parts per million for lead being acceptable. And that was what our initial findings told us, and that's how we did our initial closings of different areas of the park based on 400 parts per million. Then in January, surprise, it's been lowered by half. So now it's 200 parts per million. So then we go back with our partners, go to all the different parks and look at some of the additional areas that we need to restrict access to. And so then you can see in February, we have that limits lowered. We're starting to get risk scores back from DEQ, trying to understand what those mean, making sure that we're prohibiting access for areas that are higher than 200 parts per million, reaching out to the county, the health department. And then at that point, we made an initial request for $5 million through our capital improvement program. That's what the CIP is, capital improvement program. Because at that time, we didn't have a ton of information. We had a little bit more data, but we knew with 5 parks and knew some of the challenges that we're facing, this was going to likely be a costly endeavor. So we wanted to make sure we started to secure some funding so that we could react once we get more data. Then as the spring continues, we get some information back from DEQ, some of those reports. We closed additional areas based on those findings. And then we also backtrack in February with the help of our Neighborhood Improvement Services Department, or NIS, and other community leaders. We developed I call it a community working group. And so those are made up of different residents from around the city that live nearby or just have legitimate concerns about the condition of these parks and how they can be involved. So this group is open to anybody. It's open to anybody in this room, and we can give you information and get your contact information. You can be a part of that. But this group has been really helpful for us to listen to and for them to provide feedback from anything from our fencing to understanding, pushing us to get more information out and getting out more frequently. And also this group, when we meet, has a direct contact, because oftentimes our partners, DEQ, are there too. So it's a good opportunity for some back and forth there. Okay, so in April, with the group, community working group, the DEQ, we decided we wanted to close all the playgrounds and do additional testing just to make sure that we understood all the materials that were there, whether it was existing materials, but also the plan was to remove test the existing materials. And I mean like playground mulch and some of the soil that's underneath that, then remove all that, which is right around 12 inches. And then DEQ and their partners S and ME would start to look at the deeper soils below 12 inches in the playgrounds. So then the spring, later in the spring into the summer, the DEQ expanded their search, looking across the street at East End, the other side of the park, and also the other side of Main Street, the south side of Main Street at East Durham. And they began more and more testing, all the way down to like 22 feet for their geophysical survey. And these were all step by step, mostly in order of what they have to do to start to get an understanding of what the waste is, where it could be, how deep it is. And also understand, it wasn't just about, okay, we're only going to look for lead and nothing else. It was, like I said, waste. And waste could be anything from broken glass to construction materials to plastic to bricks, what have you. So as they start this step-by-step process, they've got to go about it this way so they can have a comprehensive understanding of what we're dealing with. We don't want to react to just partial information or there's lead here or there's lead there. So as they continue to do that, they also provided us in June of 24, a preliminary cost estimate. And that was just what the information and knowledge that we all had at that time, and looking at just ground cover of what it could potentially cost if clean fill over all these areas. And remember, this was just a spot in time, limited amount of information. They estimated approximately $10 million total. So moving on through this past summer, continued meetings with our community working group, continued the testing of the playground materials. We closed additional areas based on our expanded search at East Durham and East End. We started August through October, our engagement, more of our engagement activities, which means going to where community programs were taking place, where activities and people already were going to them, and making sure there was good awareness about what this is and what it could mean to them. Then this past fall, a next big step for DEQ that they'll talk about was a term or phrase called waste delineation activities. So again, do not take my word for it. The guys are going to come up here and they're going to explain the details. But for a layperson's understanding with these waste delineation activities, they did a lot of different additional soil borings. So understanding that looking down into the soil, different depths, and understanding if they're running into waste, except lead or any other kind of waste. But also what they start to do is they start to find out where the border of this waste might be. Is it just on the city park parcel? Is it past that parcel? So that's what starts to happen here in the fall. Then as we get further in the fall, one of the first parks they started this waste delineation activities was East Durham. So they're doing these borings and they're finding, hey, in this area, we found waste, in this area, we didn't. So then they do a next step, it's called test pits and trenching. And they do these test pits and trenching, open the ground up just for during the day, test that. And then what they were doing was estimating where the border is. And I'm going to show you some images so you can have a better understanding. So it's been great to do the step-by-step process to understand where it is, the depth, where it is vertically, where it is horizontally, and get a full understanding of these things. All right, so as that started at East Durham, we continue to do the testing at the playgrounds. Northgate community reached out to the city and asked for us to come answer questions and present, and we did that in October. And then you can see November, December, we're starting to do more of the waste delineation activities, and we're getting feedback. So right now for East Durham, we have the most feedback and most data that we have of anybody. And this last week, this week, and the next few weeks, all those same activities are taking place at the other 4 parks. And I'm going to show you an image here in just a second, give you a better understanding of what we're talking about. Lastly, I'll mention here on December, as part of our budget process, city budget process, we start to make our department requests, right, for operating budget, our capital improvement program. And you saw earlier that last year last year, I don't remember the exact month, we made a $5 million request. And I mentioned we weren't sure what all could do, but some of the things that we had in mind was for that request was could we, at that time with limited information, could we use that money to maybe demo a playground that was in an area that was hazardous and build a new one in an area that wasn't? Or any other alternatives like that? Because we wanted to look for options, so we didn't have to keep these parks as closed as long as they have been. So we're really eager to open these back up and be creative and move them to different spots. But we have to keep getting information so we don't move it to a spot that we thought was okay and is not. So that was the intent. Then this past month, as our budget timeline goes, we need to start turning in our requests. And so, okay, so it's December, we've got $5 million request. Wait, you haven't spent hardly any of that money. Why not? Well, trust me, we want to spend the money, but we don't have the data that informs us to know what to do with it. Sure, we spent a little bit on some of the ugly fencing that we have to put up and things like that. So now you're asking, now you saw earlier, DQ provided an estimate of $10 million for everything. Well, I know I'm a Parks and Rec major, and 5 plus 7 is not 10. I get that. But I'm asking for 7, because we don't know. And the state said that $10 million is preliminary. It's likely to go up. And when's the last time anybody in this economy is under budgeted something? So that's the intent, is be able to have some funding available. We also anticipate, and Wade was wrong about this, Wade was wrong about that, that's fine. I'm not guaranteeing it, but we're very hopeful that by the end of this calendar year, December, we should have a lot more data and information than we ever had before. My hope, my intent is that if we have this $12 million in a fund already, and then we have data that better informs us, and I do mean us, this group and all of Durham residents, then we can share that information, and then we can start developing a menu of options and saying, here's what the data tells us about this park. And here, I'm making this number up, like, here are 3 options that we could consider at this park, and these are the 3, cost estimates. And it's getting that feedback. And so the entire community, whether you live next to the park or 10 miles from it, will have an opportunity to know about that, provide input and opinion. And then we, the city, collect all that data, all that information, and likely it'll come down to a policy decision that our city council will have a say in. And so that is a timeline or a way that I see this going. So that is why we've asked for 5. That is why I've asked for 7 currently. And this budget request goes into the FY26 budget, which won't get voted on and or approved until July 1, because our fiscal year is July to June. So you zoom in just a little bit in the middle picture. Again, this will all be online. You have it whenever you want, print out, zoom in. And I think there's packets out back. So I mentioned the waste delineation activities. And I mentioned the test pits and trenches. Can you
Where do you need?
in the middle, the middle slide? Keep going, we're flying in. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I mentioned borings. Sometimes they are boring, I know, sorry. I couldn't resist. But what you see here, and there's a key on here, okay? These are different boring sites. The purple boring sites is where they did soil borings and they found waste. And waste could be lead over 200 parts per million. It could be plastic, brick, what have you. The blue dots here, and this is, I'm sorry to orient you. This is East Durham Park, okay? Playground area, shelter. This location right here, because we're zoomed in so much you can't see. This was the site of the former center. This is Main Street. This is part of the park down here, field. Okay, so again, purple were borings that there was waste present. And blue is where they did not find waste present. And because of these waste delineation activities, you can see this black line, dotted line. That is right now the presumed border of the waste. So as it looks right now, this area here, this is the elementary school over here. This area is not finding any waste here and up there, and there's some areas down here as well. So the test pits and trenches I mentioned, that these are the rectangles here, and the yellow is where they dug the trench. This is where they dug the entire trench. The yellow is where they found waste. The pink is where they didn't find waste. So again, that was the point of this test pits and trenching that's taking place at the other 4 parks right now. Okay, you can zoom out. And later on, after DEQ, we can come back to any slides and zoom in. So right now, for waste delineation activities, these other 4 parks, they've done a lot of the borings, okay? But they have not yet got to those test pits and trenches. So right now, this is just what phase we're in right now. And so when DEQ and SNME finishes that, we'll get even more information about, are there areas, most importantly, right? Are there areas that we can reopen and have access to again? So you can see a little bit here. Northgate Park here, this is the creek, this is the stream buffer, and you can see the blue dots where the borings were, where they did not find waste, and the red where they have. And that's the same level of completion we have for each park right now, of Lyon Park, Northgate. Again, this will all be on our website. Walltown, here at Walltown. And East End Park. So the next week or two, they'll be doing those test pits and trenching and give us an understanding exactly confirming where this border is. Now, after they find that information out, they're going to go through a series of additional tests that includes looking at water. So above ground water, below ground water, and then also doing some soil gas probes. And obviously they don't want to come in just one time and do a test of water or gas probes once and say, okay, seems okay. This will happen over a period of time. I don't know how many or what that time frame is. And they may be able to help you out with that a little bit. So we know where we've been, what's been going on, what's currently going on right now. What we as a city want to do as far as making sure parks and playgrounds as much as possible can get open as quickly as possible. What we can do right now from a funding standpoint to be prepared, but also know that we have to have the data and the support from Department of Environmental Quality to be able to do those things. So this month, those tests are going on, having this update meeting. Next, I said the groundwater, surface water, below, and gas probes to be tested. And then what my hope and what we're going to push for is that these probes, these testing can happen as efficiently and thoroughly as possible. But by the end of the year, do we have all the information we need to see some significant impacts and access to our parks? So that's what we're hopeful for. That's what we're going for. And this was just some of the examples. I mentioned the engagements that we did, going to where people are through summer and fall. Again, I said at the beginning, I apologize for the amount of talking I've had to do tonight, but it is a lot of information. It will be available. And we'll be available tonight to answer questions, but after this meeting, we can answer questions, or we can come out to your neighborhood meeting or whatever it is. Because that's when all my questions hit me the best, is on the drive home or in the shower, that kind of thing. When I that. So I'm gonna pause there for a second. If you have questions, make sure you write them down. And then I believe Jerry from SNME is going to have a little bit more detail for you about some of the information I just talked about. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Lee. So it's just right?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Gerald Paul. I'm with S&E. We're a consultant for NCDEQ. I apologize in advance, just getting over a cold, so still a little congested. Wade did a really good job of breaking down the timeline of when things were done with our investigations. I'm gonna go into a little more depth. We have a lot of information to cover. I only have 20 minutes to cover it, so I'm gonna go from a 10,000-foot view. And I'm gonna talk in very general terms, and then afterwards, I'll field questions and we'll be able to answer anything we can to help you out. So we had a meeting previously back in May, and that's when we were just getting started with the investigations. And we went through each individual park one at a time and broke down everything we did at each park. For this presentation, I'm going to talk in general terms about all 5 parks because we've now completed investigations at all 5. So in this general order, the reason I have them up here by DEQ's tracking numbers, they go in order of East Durham, Lyon, East End, Walltown, and Northgate, and that's just for our record keeping. One thing I want to point out, usually when we're working for the pre-regulatory landfill group, we're investigating a single landfill. This was new to us where we're trying to treat 5 sites like one. So when you talk in terms of lead contamination or any sort of contamination, you're talking in terms of the parks. For us, there are 5 individual sites, and each one has their own complexities. So I'll talk about those a little bit more as we go forward. So again, this is kind of to rehash what we talked about in May, but just in case you weren't at that meeting, I'll go through some of these things. One of the main things we're doing now, this process is called remedial investigation. We're looking to identify potential receptors, anything that could contaminate people, drinking water, potable wells, the soil you could come in contact with, impacted media of all types. The initial investigation, we did a geophysical survey, and that's where they take a look at the ground surface. It's non-destructive, so they're looking down into the soil to try and identify the waste boundary. As Wade indicated, we're talking about in terms of the delineation. Typically with a pre-regulatory landfill where there's a lot of plastic, metal, and that sort of thing, the geophysical survey gives you a pretty good idea where to start, and then you go from there. So we started with the geophysical survey. An above ground vapor survey, this is where you're looking for potential vapors that come off of the waste. Typical waste, plastics, fabric, and that sort of thing, it off gases a lot as it's breaking down. With this type of waste, this incinerator waste, it's been burned, so a lot of those vapors aren't present, but we still need to look for them potentially. Wade mentioned some of the other media types that we're going to be sampling in the future: surface water, groundwater, sediment, and the soil cover samples. We started our investigation with the soil cover. That was brought to our attention because that's where the focus was, because there was lead in the superficial soils. So that's where we started our investigation. And waste characterization. Where's waste characterization is when you're looking to potentially move the waste disposal area, dig it up, haul it off. You classify what those materials are, and you can properly get rid of them. And then I talked briefly about landfill gases and soil gas analysis. Potable water supplies, drinking water wells. For the parks, I think out of all 5 parks, we only identified 1 potential water supply well. So there really wasn't that big of a focus on that area. Background soil samples and groundwater samples. So I'm going to talk in terms of the delineation and where the waste boundary is, where we think it is. And then what we need to do once we get that information, we identify background contamination. Things that are typically found in the soils, metals that are naturally occurring in the soils that can also be at the parks. So first we need to identify the contaminants, but then we need to see what was actually in the background soils as well. So now I'm going to kind of talk about in terms of the 5 parks, the tests that we've completed, and this is going to follow Wade's timeline pretty much to the line. We did those initial first phase reports, and that's where we classified the risk of each site and identified the potential hazards around the sites. Schools, daycares, surface water features, drinking water wells, and that sort of thing. We initially started with the soil cover investigation. And when we started with that, we had no idea of the waste delineation boundary. I note that several times throughout this. I think it's really important to note we're trying to identify that waste boundary. We collected representative samples, 0 to 12 inches, to either look for quality and that's to make sure that the contaminant levels are not above the allowable standards. And thickness, just to make sure if there was no waste identified in that 12 inches, that it had suitable soil cover. Kind of an end game thing for the program. We eventually want to get to a point where there's 12 inches of suitable soil cover over the waste to protect people. We analyzed those initial samples for volatile organic compounds and lead only. This is not typical. The typical pre-regulatory landfill approach is a whole suite of analysis that we run. But because we came into this looking primarily at lead in the beginning, that was the focus. So that's kind of a reason why we sampled once and then we went back again and sampled additionally. We tried to get that additional analysis. In April, we did topographic and boundary surveys of all 5 parks. That's really for future use. If we're going to do some type of a remediation and we're going to put a soil cover, we need to know the topography and the property boundaries. At that point, once we had this initial data, we went out and field marked the areas of concern, either that exceeded 200 for lead, or there was something found in the soil that was waste materials. Said that. In May, we did the geophysical surveys, and that's when we tried to visually find the waste boundaries so we could go back at a later date and do confirmatory samples. When we do those it's more like a ground truthing. So you get the picture generally from the geophysical survey and you go back with a drill rig with a hollow stem auger and you actually drill down into the waste to identify that edge. May, we did additional soil cover investigation. And I mentioned it's the same as we did before, but we added the additional pre-regulatory landfill parameters. That's where we look for things like semi-volatile organics, a whole suite of 17 metals in addition to lead, sulfate, ammonium nitrogen, and 1,4-dioxane. I think Wade mentioned that during this phase of the investigation and the information we got from the geophysical survey, we identified some potential waste areas that were across the street at East Durham and East End. And so we included those areas in our soil cover investigation. Based on the results, we closed off some of the areas where we identified lead that was above 200 or the indications of waste. And at this point, we still don't have that waste boundary delineated. In June, Wade mentioned we provided some cost estimates to try and come up with like a worst case scenario, but that was based on the waste disposal area that we knew at the time. Now that it's grown some, obviously those costs are going to go up. In June and July, this is when the focus started to shift more toward the playgrounds. There were some questions that came in from the initial sampling about if the playgrounds were sampled. And at the time when we were doing our sampling, there were children using the playgrounds. We tried to avoid those areas, so we had to go back and focus on those areas. So that's kind of where we went.
Clarification. When you
Yes,
did that initial topsoil sampling in December 23, the playgrounds were not included in that. Is that correct?
that's correct.
So until June 24, the playgrounds were open and assumed.
That's correct. Yes. In order to remove the mulch, the gravel, and the fabric, the drainage stone that's in the playgrounds, you have to have that material tested. You just can't take it off site. And so it needed to be tested for disposal parameters. There was some confusion early on when our report came out saying that the material in the playgrounds was non-hazardous. What that really indicates is just it was suitable for disposal at a local landfill. Reports came back, everything was good. Then we focused on removing the playgrounds. In July and September, we initiated the playground removals. We removed, every one of the playgrounds was different, but in general, 12 to 18 inches of mulch, a mixture of gravel, fabric, and in some cases like a rubber mulch. I think that was East Durham. Once the playground materials were removed, we conducted soil sampling same way we did with the soil cover that was outside of the playground areas. Once we were done, we backfilled the playgrounds with geosynthetic fabric and 4 inches of stone. That's really just kind of a placeholder, just to protect people from going into those areas. We're not sure at this point what's going to happen with the playground, so we just wanted to put a barrier there. The remedial investigation reports, these are all done. They're under DEQ's review right now, so we'll have some back and forth, but I'm assuming they'll be reviewed, released to the public soon, but I'll let DEQ comment on that further. Waste materials, one thing I wanted to know, and I put this in all the reports, regardless of whether lead was detected above 200, I wanted to point out the fact that there was waste indicated in all of the playgrounds throughout the investigation at all 5 parks. I've got some pictures to kind of show along with that. One of the safety aspects of digging in this contaminated soil is exposure to people around the parks. So during that process, we did some dust monitoring and ambient air sampling, and we tested for lead. And so those samples was done during the work. The workers wore equipment, and we collected samples. All that stuff came, all the air samples came back. And we didn't expect to have much because when we were doing the mulch removals, we went through 2 gigantic storms. So it was pretty much flooded the whole time we were out there. At 2 of the parks, because of the heavy flooding, we caused some damage to the areas. A pre-regulatory landfill rule is you can't import material without having it tested first. So in order to bring in some fill material and patch those areas, we had to have that material tested and sampled, and it was deemed to be suitable. So this is just a picture, and I also brought in a couple samples for you to see, and I'll go into this a little bit further as we go along. But it's important to know what the waste looks like. I wanted to start this presentation by giving a shout out to all my folks that did the field work over the last year. They've done a lot of sampling, done a lot of work out there. And it's not typical to see the waste in this format. Like I said, they're used to seeing fabric and glass and plastic that comes up. These 2 pictures were taken underneath the playgrounds at Northgate. And so you can see chips of old cups, brick, glass, even some unburnt plastics were noted inside in the waste. You can see those in the sample. Lots of ceramic, all the things that the incinerator would not burn off. September 24, we mentioned, now we're on to that next phase. So we went out and did waste delineation borings over East Durham. And that's where we tried to ground truth the extent of the waste area. We use a hollow stem auger and a drill rig to go out and get a clean and a dirty location just to make sure we can find that boundary. The results were good, but because of the nature of the waste, it's really hard to see in the field. Like I said, when you're usually drilling in plastic, you see a lot of material come up. This stuff looks like soil. And so in Durham, you typically have what's called a Triassic material. It's like an orange or a purplish silt. And it's pretty common to see. This stuff is black and granular. It kind of looks like sand with little bits of glass and brick mixed in with it. So when you're drilling and you're looking for that, if you're in it, you can see it. If you're going through just a sliver of it, and I've got a really good cross section in here to show, you can miss it. So that's what. So in addition to our borings, we wanted to go back out and do trenches and actually take a big excavator, dig a big trench and be able to see that soil profile. And you'll see that coming up in my pictures. December 2025, since East Durham is kind of going the way of being our test site, we now have the waste boundary delineated there, and we're going back to do background soil samples. So we'll be able to use that information to offset some of the contaminants that were identified on site. That report's under development now. I'll have that to be at the beginning of the month, and then they'll get that out to the public as soon as they can. That data will, like I said before, that data will be used to generate site-specific background concentrations. And what that'll do, it'll generally wash out anything that was typically at the site, and it'll take away and it'll leave behind anything that's in excess of those background concentrations. So this is at East Durham Park. And when we went out and did our borings, our delineation borings is about 2 feet back here. And we actually hit it spot on. You can see that there's only a small vein of the waste here. You've got fill material above it and native soil beneath it. And as you get closer toward the creek, it gets thicker and thicker. So as you can understand, when we're drilling down with those augers, we see that soil come up. You would have to hit it exact on the nose to be able to see what that material looks like. As you get thicker into the waste, it's more apparent and it's easier to see. But that's what was so difficult about finding that waste boundary. That's why we wanted to go out with the trenches. And so as Wade indicated, now we're going back to all the sites that we've done the delineation borings. We have a pretty good idea of where that waste boundary is, and we're gonna confirm it with these trenches just to make sure we didn't miss anything. So for the next few slides, I'm gonna go through these quickly. They're the maps that Wade already showed you, but I can generally show you the waste disposal areas. This was the first soil cover and the second soil cover data. So this is the East Durham Park. The grids you can see that are highlighted in red exceed 200 for lead. The ones that are in purple exceed what's called the NCDEQ risk calculator. And that's where they throw all the other chemicals that were detected in the site and to determine risk, to see if it's suitable for public use. So that's East Durham. That was just the soil cover. This is the delineation. So you can see our waste delineation boundary here. Wade indicated our test pits were used. The picture that I just showed you was that test pit, that trench. And it goes from the waste area to clean. So we use that to define the boundary. We have waste up to this property boundary and up to this property boundary. And so right now we're trying to get access to these adjacent properties so we can continue the investigation to make sure we get that boundary set. Once we go through this exercise at the other 4 parks, we'll be able to put together these complete reports like at Durham. This is a heat map. We generally use this with the boring data that we had. This isn't all the points in between, but just to generally show the waste thickness. So in yellow here, you can see this is about a foot, the waste is about a foot thick. And as it gets closer to the creek here, our deepest boring had the waste going down to 20 feet here. Along the property boundary on the east here, waste was about 7 feet thick. And so again, once we get through that next the field information, we'll be able to provide this for all the parks. Lyon Park, again, we're in the process of delineating the wastes, grids that failed for lead. One thing I want to note here, and there may be some confusion if you wind up reviewing these reports, some of these areas that are hatched, they're indicated as lack of soil cover thickness. That does not necessarily mean that there's waste there. When our investigators are going out collecting soil samples in that 0 to 12-inch range, if they identified anything that wasn't native soil or natural soil, they marked it as waste. So if there were glass fragments, and these are public parks, broken bottles, that sort of thing can settle over time. So this is ultra conservative. When we go back and we do the delineation, some of these grids may actually fall out of that waste boundary. So I want to kind of clarify. If you have any questions about that, we can answer it further. This is Lyon. Based on the delineation borings, this is where we believe the waste to be located. We have trenches coming with the next phase of work that's going to shore that up. This is the East End Park. Same thing. We investigated across the street. We only had 1 grid fail for lead and 1 failed the NCDEQ risk calculator, but then we had some spotty material located in some of those borings. When we went out and did the delineation borings, we found that the waste was prevalent in the center of the park here, and we were able to delineate around the extents. It extends well down into the paint shop area, and we believe it pretty much goes up to the creek on the boundary. Even though those borings don't show it, there's really not much room to go beyond that tree line to get some samples. Let's see, Walltown Park. We were actually here earlier today doing some of the trenching. So you can see the bulk of the site is grids that failed for lead and or soil cover. Based on the delineation borings, this is where we believe the waste to be. And we're doing trenches to make sure that the waste is not going off site in these directions. And we'll also look to the south. We may have to get access agreements to the southern properties. Northgate. One thing I want to point out too, during the geophysical survey, you can also get some false positives because it's looking for things beneath the surface that look like waste. When we went out and ground truthed, we were able to eliminate the whole half of this park where there was no waste out there, but it was determined that in the geophysical survey. And again, you can see we had a lot of these grids where it looks like they failed for soil cover, but that's just because there was miscellaneous material in that upper 12 inches. Based on the delineation borings, you can see that the waste boundary appears to be contained to the eastern part of the site, and unfortunately is near the playgrounds. So that's like the worst case scenario. Talk a little bit briefly about the ongoing investigations. We mentioned we're doing trenching in the test pits at the 4 remaining parks. This work should be wrapped up by next week. We finished early here at Walltown. We have a couple spots that we need to check. We're moving on to East End, and after that, Lyon Park, and that'll be it for the trenchings. Once I get that information, I'll summarize those reports and get them to the state for review and then for public access. There's not a lot of lab data associated with those reports, so they should go pretty quick. Again, this data is going to be used to establish those waste disposal areas. Then we're going to go back and we're going to do the additional investigations for background soils away from the waste disposal area. And then all the other things, the groundwater, the soil gas that I previously mentioned. Background soil samples, surface water. And surface water is just to identify any potential contaminants in the surface water that could be released from the landfill. We also look upstream and downstream of the landfill, so we're looking for things that are coming onto the landfill as well. Groundwater assessment, I think Wade alluded to this, and it's important to note with the groundwater assessment and the soil gas assessment that will also be coming up. It may be necessary to go out and do multiple sampling events. If we go out and we get all clean data, it could be one thing. If we get contamination, we may have to delineate further and we may have to take a couple rounds of samples to qualify that data. So the same thing, we'll go out and do the soil gas. And then that's it. Once we're finished with all that, it's a lot of work. I don't want to put a timeline, but I know the questions are going to come and how soon we can do these. I'm working with the state now on the assessment of the soil. The soil gas, the groundwater and the surface water. And those will be underway within the next month. So once we get that rolling, we're going to do the same thing with the other 4 parks. So it should pick up steam. We should be able to get that media sample pretty quick. And that's all I've got. Do we have any questions?
I do.
Yes, sir.
My name is Thomas Long. And my concern is this. I travel around the city and what I noticed, these contaminated parks are located in certain areas. I was born and raised, I see one person here, 2 people that live in Walltown. They were babies, well, maybe wasn't born when I lived here. I'm 7, 8 years old. My concern is this. It's great to talk about cleaning up and stuff. But I'm concerned about what effect did it have on a little boy like me, who was born and raised here. I played on a basketball court in that base where that parking lot is right there. It used to be a clay basketball court. I played on this field over here where it used to be a baseball field. I honed my skills where I went on and I graduated from college and I played professional basketball with the Hall Globetrotters. Now, what bothers me is for me to come back to my Walltown, which is a place where we were raised by a village. That's how these kids were raised over here.
Walltown back.
But not to hear anybody talk about the effects that it had on somebody like me and people that are dead. You see, we need to look at the whole picture. Now, I'm not gonna take a whole lot of y'all time, but if there's any news reporters here, or somebody want to talk to somebody that know Walltown. I wrote a book called 4 Streets and 4 Blocks. I talk about Walltown. I'm the author of 17 books. I'm one of them boys, the people in Durham said there wasn't gonna be what S. But this community that was where kids was raised by a village produced a young man like me to go on and travel around the world and introduce this city and this state in countries that didn't even have television. It's a shame for me to come back here and see that it took 76 years for somebody to discover that these parks was contaminated. Now, I'm not gonna take a whole lot of your time because I know some other people have a question. But if you have a question for me, or if you wanna know something about Walltown, I'll be back there with reporters. I've been trying to talk to somebody for years about Walltown, how they're closing these ball fields down, closing these recreation centers. That's why we're having crime around here. These kids ain't got nowhere to go. Now, if you wanna learn something and know something about all of this mess, contact me. I'm standing back here. If you wanna talk to me, I'll be willing to talk to you. I got stuff in writing. I've done research. Thank you, sir.
Yes. Did I understand that remediation is being planned is to cap the waste, not to remove it?
No, we don't have all the information yet. What I mentioned earlier is once S&ME and state finish all their analysis and stuff and reports, then we start to begin a menu of options of what we could do. And where everyone in this room and everyone in the Durham community can have a say of what they think should happen to these parks. So we don't know yet.
Just follow on clarification. So we know from Greensboro, North Carolina, that's about 10 years ahead of us, dealt with the same situation in a 12-acre park there, Bingham Park. They were able to raise about $14 million over 10 years from state, local, and federal sources. And just to remediate that one, and it's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. So it's about twice the size as Walltown Park, and to just cap and cover that part is they're going to be spending $12.4 million on that. So I am curious how y'all got to 10 million for 5 parks. And like what exactly, yeah, I mean, understanding it's all super preliminary, understanding like what we could expect for that kind of a price tag versus what more likely it will cost. But we would expect more like, it to be closer to maybe like $100 million for parks to be fully remediated.
Sure, understand. And I can let DEQ kind of answer further, but I'll take just the initial. So when we were asked to come up with the cost estimates, it was based on limited information at the time. So really, the only thing we could take into account were the areas where we had known contamination. So like I said, we didn't have a waste boundary. We just had areas where there had been lead exceedances. And so we crunched some numbers to put a 12-inch soil cover over those areas. And then also address some stream restoration at Walltown and East End that would also potentially be effective, but they were not deep numbers. It was more preliminary. Brian, does that sound correct?
Yeah, that's okay. Good evening. I'm Brian Channel. I'm the supervisor for the pre-reg landfill program, and Kevin Kelt's the project manager for all 5 of these parks. So that cost estimate was for 12 inches of clean soil to be installed over top of the footprint of the waste area. So that's the cost difference between what you're seeing in Bingham Park and in here.
And that's for like a patch, sorry, I'm understanding, it's not like 12 inches of soil over all of Walltown, but just the areas that exceed the safe limits for contamination.
It would
So it'd be like patchwork a little bit.
the delineated waste disposal.
We were involved with Bingham Park as well. So we helped with those cost estimates and the reason the cost was so different. There were many different factors. There's a sheer wall of waste that went down to the surface water to cut through the park. So that waste needed to be dug up, pulled back, laid down in a proper slope. There were underground utilities, fiber optic lines that would need to be dug up and removed. And that's the thing. We're not at that point with the parks yet where we know where all those potential hazards are and obstacles that could potentially add on to that soil cover. But that's the difference of digging up waste versus covering what's there. Could make it a lot easier to deal with.
So you mentioned that some of the waste was quite shallow, and that some of it was just miscellaneous crap that shows up in parks, but some of it was in areas of contamination. And I'm struggling a little bit with the timeline, like these parks are built, nobody ain't seen no trash out there when they were putting up swing sets or putting in parking lots if it's shallow, and nobody thought,
This building,
right?
this building.
Yeah, so I'm curious about that as similar to the fellow who was here before, and that's.
Oh, no,
It's
it's
not
fine. Yeah,
your
no,
problem. And, you know, like that long-term exposure, and I'm gonna be honest, I used to be a city employee. I used to observe construction in parks. Nobody told me there might be shit in the ground. You know, so similarly, that fellow who was there before, what is that long-term impact? How are we dealing with that for people?
Not sure I can answer that question.
Yeah, that'd probably be a better question for the Department of Health. And what history they have and finding reports perhaps, so we can check with them.
Does that mean where you haven't spoken to them about the impact on the community, the likely impact from other village sites?
That's not what it means, well.
Then you should be able to answer.
Hi, I'm also a TEQ. I'm a toxicologist. And so I can answer some of these questions, but not all of them. I don't work for Health and Human Services, and so I know a lot more about environmental toxicology than human health. But long-term exposure to lead is really dependent on the kind of lead it is and how bioavailable it is. There's lots of different species of lead. And a lot of the instrumentation that's used in this kind of analysis just tells you total lead. And so it's hard to say what the effects of different kinds of lead are. There are different things you can do. And so there are, I looked up the name of the program. The State Laboratory of Public Health analyzes blood for children under 6, pregnant women, refugee children 16 and under, at no cost to Medicaid or NC Health Choice benefits. A finger stick is the preferred test method, and so you can get tested, your kids can get tested for free. You can also have this test done at a doctor's office.
Sure, I understand the lead testing
Yeah.
for blood tests. That's for recent exposure. I'm talking about the years of being around this stuff. That doesn't show up in your blood test.
It's not easily metabolized. And so often it does accumulate.
Speak up a little bit, please.
I'm sorry, yeah. Lead is not easily metabolized, and so if your blood concentrations are elevated, it likely indicates a longer term exposure. Not across the board, but it's a general rule of thumb with a lot of contaminants like this. The best way to understand a health effect with lead is to equate it to a level in your blood. That's the easiest way for them to say that, like, this level of exposure can lead to these health effects. Just because measuring your tissues is the most accurate way to determine your exposure.
So what else is in this dirt besides lead? It was a dump, right? So there was more than just lead in there.
Yeah, we tested for a variety of contaminants. There's a few VOCs, volatile organic compounds detected. There's other metals that was detected, manganese. It's all in these reports that are published online.
Arsenic and chromium, though.
Yeah, there's arsenic, chromium. A lot of that's also naturally occurring in the soils around North Carolina too, which is also really important. Why we need to get this background soil sample data. Yeah, a lot of different contaminants like that.
And what are the health effects of those?
Speak for that.
Yeah.
Well, the possibility.
Again, the different species of chromium and arsenic are important when you're talking about this. And so I can look at the reports and the analytical data and see what the species are. I don't know offhand. I've been looking at totals for the last few days to compare to the meeting, but I see now, that's not what I should have done.
In general, then.
A lot of metal and element exposure leads to delayed school age readiness in children, which is a big swath of things. There are also certain like growth markers, and so some kids won't get as tall or won't like grow up to be as strong. the most important time in your life when you're exposed to these that can have the biggest effect is when you're a kid and still growing.
Wow.
Which is why we're very concerned about the playgrounds in the park. But kids are also part of the program where they can get their blood measured for free. And that can really tell you kind of how to monitor the different markers as they develop.
But the major barrier that we've had is that when asking for the health department to come out, there was pushback to actually coming to the department saying people instead should go and get their blood tested, which is an additional barrier if you've ever tried to schedule anything at the health department. So why hasn't there been a more proactive push to really make sure, and this is more to those who've already been in the loop before, about why there hasn't been a more proactive push around health and this in all of these.
So let me ask you a question here.
Well, let me try to, I'm not the health expert, but we have, as a city, have constantly, from the very beginning, reached out to the county health department for their involvement. In their input.
No, it's here.
Like I mentioned before, we reach out to them, they're aware of this issue. I think they had set up some testing early on, is that right?
They didn't publicize it, and then they didn't have enough people coming in, and they cut it off without any publicity to the community or information about the fact that they were gonna cut it off.
Okay.
And then when it was requested to be reinstated after an actual PR campaign, by the way, they do have a community educator on salary, they did not do that.
So let me get to my question.
I
Thank
just
you.
wanna, I borrow one deaf ear, or I feel like you're borrowing deaf ear.
Maybe you can make the next meeting.
To follow up with our county administration and county staff to make sure that.
So here's my question. Y'all finished? Okay. For 30 years, you all didn't know that this community was contaminated along with any other community contaminated with landfills for 30 years. Duke didn't tell you all that it was contaminated. How is that possible?
When you built this building.
I'm confused because you've had 30 years and you're trying to tell us that the city council back then and now didn't know anything about this landfill until to come and tell you something that you all should have known.
And what's the 30-year mark you're referring to?
30 years in Walltown, 30 years, you've been here 30 years.
Okay. Again, as a parks person here, and I forget when this building was actually built.
Does it matter in the building?
Yeah, it matters
Because
because they should have tested this soil.
Right.
When we built this building.
right, but see, the building was
If
already
you
here.
tested the soil when this building was built, seemed like
So
you
then-
would know what was in the soil. And if you knew what was in the soil at that particular point, you would notify the citizens that live around it. I was one of the people, and a bunch of people in here were people who sat in these meetings to get this building built. But nobody told us, or when you build a building, don't y'all do soil tests? They do soil testing,
Right.
make sure that.
So there's a. Yeah.
I'm just asking
point
common
that-
sense questions.
My point that
You
20
test the
years ago,
soil, so somebody knew.
somebody 20 years ago, you all want to build, redo, this community center, 20-some years ago. And the building back then was supposed to cost $3 million. Then you came back, and because at that time, if you did your job, you came back and said you want to put a swimming pool here. And I asked this question 20 years ago when you had School of Math and Science. Why would you put a swimming pool when you got a big old ditch running through the middle of Walltown Park, going to the other side, and not cover that thing up? But you went out here and built a new kids facility, knowing that this soil was contaminated. You all didn't do anything about it until Walltown started to change. People can say what they want to say. I've always said from day one that race always plays a part in the city council maneuvering. What you did was say, screw the black community. We're going to sacrifice your kids. When the white folks moved up in here, all of a sudden now Duke had this big bright idea, or the soil was contaminated. So who works for Duke? Because there's no way in the world that Duke can come here and tell us that's something that you all should have told us. And if Duke have to come and tell us, then we don't need you city council members, and we don't need your staff here, because you're not doing your job.
I just want to make sure I address, as the council member, very clearly, when there are elevated levels of lead in a trial that is presented, there is always research done. That has not been the case. And so if there were a whole swath of children from Walltown who showed up with elevated lead levels, the county would have had to address it.
Now, you
And that
know
wouldn't
good,
happen.
now, you,
And I
come
can
on,
definitely
Freeman,
track
you know good as well,
I can
the black
track
community did not have the resources or the knowledge to do anything at all.
So,
But you all
let's
did.
be very clear that
Be very clear.
if a child has health insurance and they have physicals on an annual basis, whether with Medicaid or private pay, they get lead tested. That is a requirement for a child between the ages of 0 and 6.
If you know it,
No.
if you know it, how many parents do their kids for lead tests? Come
They
on.
don't have to take them for a lead test. That is done on an annual basis during a physical. If you want to have the conversation, we can have a conversation, but this is not this. What I want to make sure is that you're not trying to track it like if there were elevated levels of lead for children in this community, like specifically for Walltown, so like the gentleman that just left, it would have shown up. That's not what we're talking about today.
No, I know what you're talking
about. Is, and I hear you on the.
I know what you're talking about. No,
No,
you don't hear me, because we're trying to do something totally different. What I said was very clear, is that if you knew, and you should have known, that it was lead in these parks.
Let's be clear.
No, don't be clear
There's
nothing at this
lead
time.
everywhere.
You should
There
be
are
clear
lead
when you didn't
levels
get the chair.
everywhere. When they're
You should be clear then,
elevated.
not now. You should be clear back then.
I'm being clear.
Okay, when you take this city council, you've been here long enough to know if this park was full of lead or not. It took you 25, 30 years, and you didn't do it, Duke did it. My concern is that if Duke was able to find it, why didn't you?
But that's what
20
I'm
years
saying.
ago.
That's what I'm saying to you, is that you can find it, the elevated level that would have appeared would be different. So there would be lead here, just in general, like there's lead in soil. There's
Did
lead
you test
in
it?
water.
Did you test it before?
Well,
Okay, you don't
The
know.
building was.
Thank
built,
you,
they have to
thank
test
you,
it.
thank
They
you.
have to
I just
test
want to
it.
know.
Those levels are gonna show up in any testing.
I just want to
report.
know if Duke had the one to come and tell us about the lead in these parks, what are their job for? If Duke is the one that's pushing and come out here and tell us that our park was contaminated with lead, there's a problem. There's a big problem with that. Well, Duke doesn't run the city, or do they?
I just wanna make it clear.
Okay,
You
go
didn't
ahead.
have to tell you, no, you didn't have to tell you, we knew it was lead.
Well, you didn't tell us.
You should know this.
You didn't tell us. I don't have children.
You don't have to-
So I guess based on what she's saying, I'm curious, if there was testing done before the building was built, at what level does lead have to be present before somebody says, we're not gonna build a thing, or we're not gonna do a thing? If that's what's actually, if that what actually happened.
I can try to speak a little bit of that for you. And also to what you were saying earlier, whenever this facility was built, part of not our department, but the city, whether it's engineering or general services, they're required to do some different environmental studies before they do any construction. So whatever that may be, they're required to do that. At that time, and this is dangerously speculative, but when you said what levels? Well, when we started this process, we knew 400 parts per million was the threshold. And then halfway through, EPA lowered that to 200. So it likely would have been 400.
I'm wondering that, I mean, you guys, you're representing the work that's happening right now to remedy this whole thing. I'm hoping in your report that you do touch on a history of how these sites, these parks got to this point. And then what do we do in the future that we don't build recreation areas on top of that? Because I think that's where there's value to what's happened historically, and what's going to happen in the future. And there's a lot of stuff that went in. I respect the history that Walltown particularly here represents. You guys, you're just here doing this job right now and you're taking this feedback, but you're going to write a report. And out of that report, I think there's some opportunity also to say, you know, this is how we got there. This was a waste site of various kinds, all these 4, 5 parks were. And so let's, you know, pay more attention next time we build. In the future, if there's some recommendations you guys can make as to how we go about future planning to incorporate that, I think that would be a helpful report.
Like that happen.
So based on your dangerous speculation, understood, 400 parts per million, you said you looked at overall lead levels. Are the overall lead levels above 400 parts per million? So, and if so, how does that escalate over time? Is it the case that generally you see that when this thing was built, it might have been lower and now it's elevated to a point now that it is something at that level, but it wouldn't have when it was built? Just trying to get an understanding based on what folks are asking, how we could have gotten to this point.
Sure. I think that the graphs that you showed were based on 200, which is the new, or the figures are based on 200, which is the EPA updates things every 5 to 10 years. So the dark red spots are the ones that are above the 200 parts per million in lead, which is the soil remediation. That's
No, but in the reports, our concentrations are listed in the data table, so you can see, you can compare to the standards and see where the highest concentrations were located. And so for our purposes, for display purposes, these represent all the areas that are above 200, but there were areas that are higher concentrations. That's the same at every park. There's, it's more condensed. And without speculating, saying exactly, I know what happened, it tends to correlate with where the incinerator was located and where the waste seemed to appear to have been disposed of in front of the incinerator, so.
And
But
where
that's
is that
just,
in
we don't know
this?
where it was done back in the day.
Yeah, do you know where that is in this one? 'Cause the other
The
one's
incinerator was up here to the
Marker.
playground, yeah.
And is that like light gray strip at a diagonal of that like area that was not tested?
Where, here?
So that's the parking lot.
Yeah, it was just omitted.
And that would be why it was important to lower it, that's for the playground from 400 to 200, and making sure that those highlight areas would show up as highlights and not missed. And just knowing that there are citizens present and planning to do it.
I want to hog all the airspace, but I have the extra special bonus of not only being an employee who is exposed to dirt in these parks. I live next to one of these parks. What is the plan for places where we can see that red box with the grid on it goes right out to the property line?
Part of that,
Very lucky.
part of that delineation phase we're working on now, the trenches and the test pits, going right up to the property boundaries. So if we find lead or waste for that matter at the property boundaries, we're gonna get access to the adjacent properties. So at East Durham, I told you we had those 3 parcels that we're gonna be looking at next. Same may happen here at Walltown. I will know that once I get that information from the field, once they finish it.
And will you stop at streets, for example, there and looking up there, that's probably club or gas, where you got a red box next to the road, you won't go past the street there.
We've had a conversation about that because obviously we can't work in the main intersection, but there probably will be access to the adjacent property. So we'll go beyond that and make sure that we've got a clean extent and then work our way back.
So those properties are by the basketball court. Because Berkeley Street.
Here?
Berkeley Street backs up to the other side of the park, which is the basketball court.
Okay,
And you got a whole block of houses that back up to the park.
right.
So that'll be tested as far as the boundary.
Yeah, actually, that's what we were just out here today, doing test pits along all the parcels along this side. And then if we get waste there, we'll get access to those properties. If it happens to go beyond that, we'll keep going. Yes.
There's a state program for it, if you do find contamination on private property. So what the homeowners do if they find contamination on private property? How they divide it into that.
Yeah, it would be the same, I mean, it'd be part of the site. So the goal with this remedial investigation and waste delineation phase is to establish the site. And that's gonna be the waste disposal area and then anywhere that may have contaminated groundwater or vapor that extend beyond. So any of the parcels, public or private, that are part of that would be incorporated in the proposed remedial action plan. for that entire site.
That would enable a homeowner to have the soil removed, or are you just gonna provide, like, it seems like it's going to go up in cost very quickly.
Yeah.
And there's liability costs and resale value costs, all that stuff into that.
This is a risk-based remediation program, so the typical approach is the soil cover and leaving waste in place. The waste removal and waste relocation would be driven by any impact to a receptor. So if vapors were impacting a home or a private drinking water well, then waste can be relocated or removed in certain areas to help protect those receptors. But just the presence of waste without risk being the driver behind that, that doesn't automatically mean it would be removed. So the cover and then part of the remedial action and the remediation plan, that would include perpetual land use restrictions and a notice of environmental contamination recorded on each parcel that has impacts associated with the landfill.
Which has implications for resale value and the property that isn't actually associated to anything, any action in it.
Is there any, I'm mindful this is a hybrid event. And a friend who was online was texting about questions that are coming in virtually. Did you got that? Or is there gonna be space for them?
Jenny?
Sure. About 10 questions that have come in online. We can start with the ones that have to do with the cost of remediation. So there are some questions. Can you share more about the kind of remediation and that the cost estimates covered? And also how much of the 2024 bond money will be used towards those repairs?
I can do the second part if you want to try to.
So I think the first part's similar to the previous explanation. I mean, it's identifying the entire site, understanding the risk associated from each individual waste disposal area, and then determining the appropriate risk-based remediation.
As far as the pond project, there's one specific park, East End. And when DEQ finishes everything they need to do, so we know all the details of that park, then like I mentioned with all the other parks, we'll have different ideas of what we can do. And we'll get input from everybody in the community about what they'd like to see done. The bond dollars are not there for, and I'm splitting hairs here, specifically for some sort of remediation. But the bond dollars there are to make what residents envision for these parks to be. So what I'm trying to get at is, let's say, this is just an example, just out to paint a picture. Let's say once DEQ is done with all their reports and analysis, and that one option is, okay, we want to remove every bit of soil in those areas out, then that will be one option with one price. And then there is budget allocated to the state as part of the pre-regulatory landfill programs that can go toward that particular project. Another option could be, based on the findings, we don't know yet, that perhaps all that is needed is a dermal barrier, for example. That let's say there's no vapors, there's no water issues, but at least 12 inches of more of clean fill that separates waste from the surface is what's required. Then we can explore that. And that particular option, based on what resident feedback said at East End, they're looking for more basketball courts, pickleball, tennis courts, what have you. Then those courts could be added in that area for the bond according to resident wishes and desires, but also serve, because if it's concrete or asphalt, whatever, serve as a dermal barrier, just as another example.
We have some more online if we.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead, Jenny, what's the next one?
How is the city engaging different departments to address these different concerns? In particular, they asked about NIS and the health department. And I know that in previous questions, there was also questions about where the health department was and what they're doing around this issue as well.
Well, we mentioned earlier, we reach out to the health department. They're aware. as far as their participation, I think Council Member Freeman, mentioned she was going to connect with the county. James, you can speak for your.
Sure, my name is James Davis. I work for Neighborhood Improvement Services and we are here. So we are working in collaboration in conjunction with DPR on the engagement portion. So I think that response to that question, the two departments are working hand in hand on the engagement. What's the next question, Jenny?
So what are the city's plans for longtime residents and former students who are too old to qualify for free lead testing? And what are the plans for restitution for those who are affected? Cleaning of the park is great and necessary, but that is not sufficient to make amends.
I don't think we have those answers yet. We're gonna find out more of what we got in front of us. And Councilmember Freeman has already pledged her, efforts toward the county to get more information.
And I will just say, like, speaking from experience on, being in a home that led poison a child and having to have lead remediation like this is not usually, I understand the psychological warfare that you go through and trying to figure out whether you have been lead poison and if your children have been lead poison or your siblings, like all of that, I'm very clear on. But what I don't want this conversation to get sidetracked. It'd be better to have a separate conversation about what the remediation is for those who were previously here and what it looks like to try and address some of that. If there was a case that came forward or if it wasn't, like that needs to be actually dug into with actual data. And if folks want to get their blood tested, I'm sure we can figure out between the city and the county, whatever supports need to be put in place to do that. But I do want to say it's going to take a little bit of pressure. I know we got all new, almost all new county commissioners, and I'm the only council member here today. So just making sure you're reaching out to your representatives and they know that this is something that you want to see done very clearly and plainly.
We'll let you know that the questions that are being proposed on the Zoom call, they will be printed and sent to the respective persons here so we can get a response. And then we'll make sure that those questions and answers are online because you guys won't hear what those questions are. They're hearing what those questions are. I do also want to go ahead and do a time check. It is going on 7:30. We did say that we were going to start on time. We were just a few minutes from starting on time, just for technical difficulties or technical setup. I won't say it was difficulty. So I will say, just for the sake of getting us out on time, if we can wrap up by 7:35. So that gives us 7 minutes.
And James, we do have one more element on the agenda. If people are interested in sticking around, we have the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network here to do a soil shop demonstration. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, sure. But question for the agency, I think it's outfield my time and then talk if folks want to stay past that 7:35.
Okay, so let's get one more question from the Zoom, Jenny, and then we have one question in the back here in the room and one question over in the back in the room. So we got 3 questions.
Sure. Why has East End Park continued to be mowed and well maintained and Northgate Park has not?
Hey.
I'm not sure East End is being mowed well maintained differently than any of the other parks. So earlier, I can't recall what month it was. Our team and our risk management staff from the city got together to see how we could maintain all the parks so that not only they don't become unkempt and provide a whole new source of new problems, but most importantly, we also want to make sure our team members could safely do that. So I think it was late summer, early fall. We went through that. They do have some personal protective equipment. They did some air monitoring as well. They didn't find any hazardous lead in the air if they did mow. And right now we have a standard that is, they won't mow as frequently as they normally do and keep the grass a little higher. So it prevents them from having to mow too much, but they shouldn't be all kept the same standard now.
And
Question.
very quickly, Miss Barbara Elliott wants to know if she uses the Walltown Center to walk on the indoor track, and she wants to know if the building itself is contaminated.
No, this is.
You're good.
everything-
Miss Elliott, you're good.
All right, question in the back?
Thank you all for the presentation and information. I have a question regarding the playgrounds. I read the recent reports on T-clip samples. My understanding is nothing came back positive. So my question for you all is the timeline on playgrounds, since, you know, basically the remediation, as I understand it, will be pretty much exactly what was already there, right? Which is like a dermal barrier and a liner. So are you still expecting to have to wait like another 12 months for vapor tests, or what's the timeline on playgrounds? Especially, I mean, I realize the results under the playground might come back, you know, hot for certain things. But I mean, we're playing on mulch, not on dirt, that's a playground, so I'm trying, like, what is the timeline for getting that done?
I'll let Ryan take the second part of that, but just, I mentioned that earlier in the presentation about the T-clip results. So that was just of the mulch itself and the stone that was sampled for disposal, so that wasn't of what was in place to be tested, the soil itself. It was just for getting rid of the mulch and the rock, so just wanted to clarify. Ryan can talk about that.
The other important factors are the landfill gas probes and the above ground vapor survey before any decision can be made. And we're gonna make sure there's not any hazardous or explosive vapors.
So, I mean, the fundamental question was timeline. Do you have a timeline at all now or not? There are so many issues, it's very complex. So is there a timeline when you might think that all these affected parts might be usable again? Or within our lifetime, 5 years, 3 years? I mean, that's, you know.
The data collection probably at the end of this calendar year, because there's still an extensive amount of field work and data that needs to be gathered. And then with the landfill gas probes and the groundwater monitoring wells, those have to be sampled multiple times. So we can't do that just 4 consecutive days.
2 or 3 years. I'm not trying to hurry and just say it would be nice to have some kind of cloudy idea, but, you know.
I can say, because I've been working on these sites for a long time. I know the answer. You want a definitive timeline. I understand. But what I can say is that these sites have been getting the priority focus. And so, like I said, with our focus on East Durham Park, we're trying to use that as kind of a sample for the rest of the parks to see how fast we can get through the next step and get everything sampled all at once, so we can get the answers to the EQ so they can help make that decision. And I mentioned that the one work plan for East Durham is going in soon. There'll be 4 more right behind that. So we understand that it's a priority to get this information to DEQ. Beyond that, like Ryan said, it will take some time to digest that data.
Will that be 4 more simultaneously or 1 at a time?
Reports.
Are you gonna do 4 parks simultaneously when you find out at East Durham, or you're gonna do 1 at a time?
We'll be doing 1 at a time, because we're gonna do everything all at once, the surface water, the soil gas, and the groundwater. So we're gonna try and do the shotgun approach to sample all the media at once, and then we'll move on to the next one. We're limited by drilling availability and subcontractors, so, you know, we can line them up, but we can only do them so fast.
And Ron, did I hear though that you're hopeful to have that additional testing, like the probes, gas probes, done by the end of the calendar year? Is that what you're saying? And then however long, barring any weather events or unforeseen circumstances, and then however long it takes you to, you know, to get the reports done, is that rough timeline?
We will definitely have all of the monitoring wells and probes installed before the end of the calendar year. I don't know that we'll have that minimum of 4 to 5 sampling events done, but it'll be close. That's our target. We're trying to get all of that done by the end of this calendar year. Once the investigation is done, then we have to develop a draft remedial action plan for each park those have to go out through public comment. And that's where we want feedback from the community members before any decisions made on money that's spent from the trust fund. So that timeline can get very lengthy. The other unknown with the timeline is if we have to step out onto multiple adjoining properties. We send access permission letters to each of those property owners. And it's a voluntary type participation, and we have to try to negotiate access at times, so that certainly can add to the timeline.
And that's fine. It's very complex. There are lots of steps. So right now, there's really no definitive timeline. And that's the reasonable answer.
I promise the last question here.
So here's my hope. These incinerators were placed in a context of clear environmental racism. The incinerator ash was then spread to Northgate Park, where there wasn't an incinerator, but it was a working class white neighborhood at the time. And yes, the city knew that those were city incinerators. When Wade came on, I know for a fact that city staff knew the history and that it was within the careers of highly placed folks in Parks and Rec that those buildings had been taken down. That's from firsthand conversations I had with those people. But be that as it may, here's where we are right now. And we can look at Greensboro and say, wow, after they got all the data, it took a decade before they did what I think is not a good solution, which was a barrier, which we know they break down over time, and soil on top of it. And from Duke's coal ash issues, we know that cap in place often still poses a problem for water. Water doesn't just come down straight from the sky and go down straight and get interrupted by that barrier. Water moves horizontally and many times too. So if we're going to keep faith with the city of Durham now doing something different than our racist past, which is truly my hope, the city itself will do something proactive, like pass bond authority in the amount of $80 to $100 million. You don't have to spend all of that. You only issue when you need to, and liberate the process of action from the reimbursement process from state or federal government, and seek reimbursement as you can. It is not something that I see as reasonable. I would see it as tremendously complicated. I'm not sure in the situation why other points of remediation need to be held up by groundwater monitoring wells. Those are site and condition specific monitorings. The history that is racist about these things is what was on those bullets that killed the United Healthcare CEO, which was delay and deny. And right now, from when the Duke team said to the city and sent the email, that was in, I believe, October of 23, and March will be 2.5 years, I think. Right? Wait, isn't it 2.5 years?
Yeah, I had a whole
just
timeline
about?
up here before you were able to be here.
Yeah,
Sure.
so we've already taken a bunch of time here. And what I would like to see is an overall commitment by the city that would expedite making this right for the community. Because these are elements, they don't break down, they're not compounds. Lead is an element, you know, arsenic is an element, chromium is an element. Even in different forms, we all know it's bad for developing neurology. And we have little kids who've been playing in the parks, and this dirt is blowing around. It's going elsewhere in the community. It's flowing in Ellerby Creek, I would imagine. So saying that, you know, we need a more coherent plan for the city of Durham that has funding authority there so that we can move ahead as quickly as possible and not keep waiting on other levels of government. These are city of Durham incinerators that were made into parks where people knew that the buildings were contaminated, that incinerator ash, there's lots of different stuff in it, was spread on these sites. City knew. And it's up to the city to make it right and to have a plan that allows moving ahead in a straight line so far as fast as possible. I'm not advocating that we be foolhardy or throw a lot of money around. But this is gonna take some money and it deserves the money. It is fundamental that we do not have our community, our kids being poisoned by the city's own property.
And with that, instead of having a bond for $200 million for restoration, but having to take that bond money, it should have been bond to clean up all this mess. That's the first thing we should have done. But we didn't do that. We vote for people like this. Y'all have a good day.
Wait, you want to close this out? I just, thanks again for spending so much time. I know you've got better things, more interesting, maybe things to do, but appreciate your questions. And know that all this information will continue to be available. We do have a working community group. If you're a part of the community working group, thank you and raise your hand. And anyone else is welcome to be a part of that as well. And we're always available for questions. Thank you.